Back before the days of modern roofs, loggers had to get creative just to stay dry and warm. They relied on old-school know-how, using materials straight from the forest, especially tree bark, to build shelters that could withstand the harshest weather. Freezing rain doesn't politely tap on a roof. It attacks, it soaks, it freezes solid. And long before tar paper, asphalt shingles, or hardware store supplies, loggers working deep in northern forests built shelters that kept them dry using nothing but tree bark. This wasn't luck. It wasn't primitive guesswork. It was skill, hard-earned, field-tested and passed down through generations who worked in forests across regions like 19th-century Canada, Scandinavia and the northern United States. In logging camps, from the Great Lakes to rural outposts far from cities, bark roofing wasn't a backup plan. It was the plan. And when freezing rain turned everything into glass, that roof could mean the difference between a miserable night and survival. Snow is manageable. It insulates. It piles up. It can even help seal gaps. Freezing rain is different. It coats surfaces in ice. It seeps into cracks before solidifying. It adds weight. It pries open weak roofing. Then it melts during the day and refreezes at night. That cycle destroys poorly built shelters. Loggers knew this. Camps in regions like Ontario and Minnesota faced brutal shoulder seasons, late autumn and early spring, when rain and sub-zero temperatures collided. Canvas sagged, wooden shingles warped. But bark, when properly harvested and layered, held up astonishingly well. Here's where things get clever. Not all bark works. The method relied heavily on species with thick, peelable bark. In northern Europe, Norway spruce was common. In North America, builders favoured white birch and sometimes elm. Birch was especially prized because its bark contains natural oils that resist water. The outer bark repels moisture. The inner bark provides flexibility. Together they form a surprisingly durable sheet when removed in large sections. Timing mattered. Bark peeled best in late spring or early summer when sap flowed. Workers made vertical cuts, then carefully pried the bark off in broad sheets to avoid cracking. If removed correctly, the tree could sometimes survive. But in logging camps, survival of the tree wasn't always the priority. The goal was large, intact panels. Bigger sheets meant fewer seams. Fewer seams meant fewer leaks. Simple logic, powerful result. A bark roof wasn't just slapped on top of logs, it followed a system. First came the frame. Poles or split logs created a steep pitch. Steeper roofs shed water faster. That was critical. Standing water is the enemy of any natural roofing. Over this frame, smaller poles ran horizontally to support the bark sheets. Then came the bark itself, laid from the bottom upward, like shingles. Each upper layer overlapped the lower layer, guiding water downhill. Overlap was generous, often 6 to 8 inches. In harsher climates, even more. In some traditions, particularly among indigenous builders of North America, a second layer was added for insulation and redundancy. The outer bark faced upward, smooth side out, shedding water. The rougher inner side faced down toward the interior. Now, here's the interesting part. In freezing rain, water would hit the slick bark surface and slide off before it had time to soak in. Even when ice formed, it typically bonded to the outer layer without penetrating the overlaps beneath. The design didn't fight the weather, it redirected it. Metal nails were scarce and expensive in remote logging camps. So bark roofing relied on weight and clever fastening. Long saplings or poles were laid across the bark layers and tied down with spruce roots, twisted fibre or wooden pegs. The weight held the bark in place against wind. The ties allowed slight movement without tearing. Flexibility was key. A rigid roof cracks under freeze-thaw cycles. A slightly flexible one absorbs stress. Spruce roots, in particular, were soaked and split into cordage. When dried, they tightened. That natural shrinkage locked everything in place. No hardware store, no steel fasteners, just wood, root and gravity working together. Staying dry was only half the battle. Loggers needed warmth. Bark alone provides moderate insulation, but camps often added layers beneath the roof. Moss, evergreen boughs, or even additional bark strips. Moss was especially effective. It trapped air, and air is insulation. In regions of Sweden and Finland, moss was sometimes packed between roof layers in early timber structures. The technique shows up in archaeological studies of medieval Scandinavian buildings and persisted into the 1800s. That combination, steep pitch, layered bark, weighted supports, moss insulation, created a roof surprisingly capable of handling wet cold. Not luxurious, not permanent, but effective. Early wooden shingles were thin and often poorly cured. In constant wet freeze cycles they warped, curled and split. Bark sheets, being thicker and more flexible, tolerated movement. Birch bark in particular has a layered structure, almost like natural laminate. Its oils slow water absorption. When properly overlapped, it behaves like a single continuous membrane. That's not folklore. Birchbark containers have survived centuries in archaeological sites because of those properties. Indigenous peoples across North America used birch bark for canoes, baskets, and even storage vessels. Roofing was a natural extension of that knowledge. In a logging camp, practicality ruled. If something failed, it was replaced quickly. Bark was available right there in the forest. Self-sufficiency wasn't optional. It was survival. This wasn't a build-it-and-forget-it system. Loggers inspected roofs regularly, especially after storms. Ice buildup was knocked loose when safe to do so. Loose ties were tightened. Damaged panels were swapped out. Because the material was local, repairs were straightforward. That's a crucial survival lesson. The best shelter materials are the ones you can replace easily. The bark roofing method thrived because it fit the environment. Abundant forests meant abundant roofing. That alignment between resource and design is something modern survival enthusiasts often overlook. Logging camps were temporary by nature. Crews followed timber, you know. Buildings might last a season or maybe a few years, tops. So heavy investment in complex roofing just didn't make sense. Bark offered speed. A small crew could roof a bunkhouse in a matter of days if the bark had been harvested and dried properly. And, well, speed mattered. Exposure kills morale fast. A dry sleeping area meant rested workers. Rested workers meant productivity. This wasn't romantic wilderness living. It was industrial-era survival before industrial convenience reached the frontier, and bark roofing delivered. Here's the real takeaway. The forgotten bark roofing method works because it respects three fundamentals: shed water fast, layer generously, and use materials that move with temperature changes. If you ever find yourself building a shelter in forested terrain without modern supplies, understanding how to harvest and layer bark could dramatically improve your odds of staying dry. But it requires planning. Harvest at the right season. Choose the right species. Build a steep frame. Overlap generously. Secure with flexible ties. Add insulation if available. This isn't guesswork. It's centuries of field-tested experience from people who didn't have backup options. Modern roofing materials became cheap, transport improved, and industrial logging camps shifted to milled lumber and tar paper by the early 20th century. Efficiency changed, tradition faded. But in the harsh environments where this method was born, it solved a specific problem brilliantly. That's the kind of ingenuity before modern times is all about. Not primitive, not crude, just smart. Freezing rain once threatened entire camps of workers deep in remote forests. And yet, armed with nothing more than bark, poles, roots and knowledge, they built roofs that held firm against ice and storm. That's resilience. That's adaptation. That's human ingenuity at its finest. If you enjoy uncovering real survival skills from history, skills that worked when there were no second chances, make sure you subscribe to Before Modern Times. Like the video if you learned something new. Share it with someone who loves forgotten craftsmanship. And stay with us as we continue digging into the practical genius of the past. Because sometimes the best solutions were growing on trees all along.